Last Sunday, we worked through the particulars of the Lord's Supper. Why do we take the Lord's Supper or communion? Where does this come from? And that sort of thing. And in part of that lesson, we tied the Lord's Supper back to its genesis in the upper room during the Last Supper. There, during that Passover meal, Jesus told his disciples that he was the Messiah that they had been looking forward to during the festival for as long as that had been a festival. And we talked about how it was this amazing time when these guys were living at the very end of the Old Covenant. It's written about in the New Testament, but they were still living in Old Testament times. A new dispensation was about to begin. Nobody was going to have to celebrate the Passover anymore once the church age started, at least not during this dispensation. And so here was Jesus and his disciples enjoying this last meal together before the crucifixion. They were enjoying a last Passover together before the new covenant kicked off. And Jesus told his guys, everything is about to change. And when all of this passes away, I want you guys to still come together and do this in remembrance of me. And so it was at this Last Supper that the Lord's Supper gets initiated. And that was last Sunday that we talked about that. But listen, I think it's nearly impossible for us to imagine the biblical events of the Last Supper and not have a picture in our minds about the Leonardo da Vinci painting of the same name. And that's because that's really the only image that we have of that event. Apparently, there wasn't a sketch artist present to commemorate the event. There's no photo albums from that day, and there's no God-inspired illustrations in our Bible either. So that da Vinci painting is really all we have to go by to get a picture in our heads of what things looked like back then. And unfortunately, it's not a very good picture. Don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful painting. It's a culturally significant piece of art. It's one of the most famous pieces of art of all times, but an accurate picture of the event, it is not. And on Sunday, I was planning to spend a minute or two talking through this, but we ran out of time, so I figured I'd save it for the midweek. And we might have touched on this a couple of years ago or so, but I think it'd be fun to go through it again today. So the short of it is, Leonardo da Vinci was an incredible artist, but he was either a bad historian or maybe he lacked biblical knowledge. Because the fact of the matter is, almost every single detail of that painting is wrong. Now, it's been suggested that he was just trying to make 15th century modern art, kind of a modern spin on a biblical tale. And a lot of art historians will make this claim. They'll say the inaccuracies were intentional. It would be like if someone today painted the scene today using modern imagery. Jesus and his disciples dressed in urban clothing, eating Hot Pockets, sitting around a table in someone's basement. And I guess that's a possibility. Da Vinci was an artist. He's allowed to paint whatever it is that he wants to paint. But I highly doubt that's why the painting turned out like it did. And I doubt that for two reasons. One, he painted this painting on a commission from a Dominican monastery in Milan. And this intentional approach of introducing modernity into the painting seems a little too edgy and blasphemous for a bunch of monks. And two, while today people receive awards for making art like this, I think back then people just got burned at the stake. So I don't think this was intentional, but whatever. Da Vinci wasn't known to be a man of faith. We'll chalk his errors up to ignorance and move on. It's still a great painting. So let's take a look at some of these details in the painting that seem to be at odds with the biblical account of the Last Supper. So the first thing to note here is that it looks like it's pretty light outside. Look in the back, there seems to be some windows or some openings in the background there, and there's sunlight and maybe some blue sky that can be seen there. But the problem is, while this appears to be a midday lunch, the Passover meal is actually always celebrated after sunset on a full moon. So in reality, during the Last Supper, if there were some open windows there, it just would have been darkness or maybe some stars or a full moon that you could see through the window, but it certainly wouldn't have been daytime. There's more problems with the building too. If you look at the room that they're in, it almost looks like an Italian palace here. Notice there's some really high walls. It's a pretty spectacular room they're in. There might be some different corridors off to the side. This really is laid out like a palace would have been in Italy at the time. But we have to remember, these guys were in an upper room in Jerusalem in the first century. It probably would have been more humble and more cramped than what this painting would depict. Also, the menu for the meal here is all wrong. It looks like what they're enjoying here is an Italian lunch, not a Passover supper. And a lot of ink has been spilled over this here, specifically arguing what exactly Da Vinci was going for here. It's got some, looks like fish on the table here, and there's arguments back and forth about what type of fish Da Vinci was painting. Was it herring or was it eels? And apparently there's significance to either of the choices and what was in his mind or what he was trying to artistically show in this painting. But the reality of the matter is that at the Last Supper, they wouldn't have eaten either herring or eel. They would have had lamb and matzah. Also, the picture is missing the 4 cups of wine that would have been included in the Passover meal. And this is incredibly significant, especially the 3rd cup. That one's known as the redemption cup, and that's the very thing that we use to commemorate this event when we're taking communion. That Jesus holding up the glass of wine, this is believed to be the 3rd cup during the Passover meal. This imagery is completely absent from Da Vinci's painting. In all fairness, though, there does appear to be at least some glasses of wine on the table, but if you look real closely, they appear to be crystal, and Jewish common people in the 1st century wouldn't have been drinking from glass. The cups likely would have been made of wood and clay instead. Also, if you think about our discussion from Sunday, the table itself is not the right shape. We talked about how they would have been seated around what was called a triclinium. It would have been a U-shaped table. This one is pretty linear and rectangular, more like what we're used to seeing today. But back then, at that time, they would have been seated around a triclinium. It was U-shaped, like we said. The guys would have been all around the outside of the table, and the servants could have gone into the inside of the U to serve them. So the shape of the table is wrong, but also the way they're seated around the table is also incorrect. They're very clearly pictured here in this painting as being seated in chairs, but the Bible makes it clear that they were actually reclining in the Roman fashion. And this is important because it makes it easier for Jesus to wash their feet. If they were reclining around the table, foot washing would have been much easier. But seated in chairs around this shaped table, washing of feet would have been a very awkward thing at best. It also explains, if they were reclining in the Roman fashion, how John was able to lean over and recline on Jesus' bosom. A key important part of the Last Supper. Would have been hard to imagine the logistics of this if they were seated in chairs around a table like this, but reclining around a triclinium, it all makes perfect sense. Also, none of these guys are seated in the right place. Jesus would have had the seat of honor, and in the 15th century, that would have been right in the middle of a table like this, I'm sure. He was the host. He would have had the seat of honor. But the place of honor around a triclinium was not in the middle. It was actually the second seat from the right end. John would have been on one side and Judas on another, and here we do have John on one side, but Judas is a couple of people over, looking the other way. What else can we say here? Well, I'm not a fashionista by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm pretty sure the guys in the painting here are all wearing 15th century Renaissance clothing instead of 1st century Jewish clothing. And while we're at it, I want to point out something that's actually not a mistake, but some people either think it is or have been confused by it. Notice, this is not meant to be a woman in the painting right next to Jesus. And this has been the center of some controversy because some people have looked at the painting and said, here's Mary Magdalene seated right next to Jesus in the painting, and this proves a particular heresy that had been going around that those two were married, and that contradicts much of what the Bible has to say. But needless to say, this is not smoking gun evidence of Mary Magdalene present at the Last Supper. This is indeed John. And here, again, Da Vinci did not make a mistake. He didn't confuse John's gender. In classical art, John is depicted in a feminine way because of his youth. That was just a normal thing to do when making artistic depictions of John and other young people at that time. You know, if you look at other art from the period, other paintings by other artists, stained glass windows, etc., that is just what John looks like. And if that artistic norm from the time isn't enough to convince you that's really supposed to be John, where is he? There's 12 other people besides Jesus in this picture. It would be kind of weird if John was conspicuously absent and Mary Magdalene was painted in his place. Well, we could probably go on for a while here, riffing on this thing or that thing, but I think we've sufficiently debunked the idea that this painting is even close to being an accurate depiction of what went on in the upper room on that night. A quick assessment here shows us very quickly, too, that Leonardo da Vinci was not Jewish and he was not much of a biblical scholar. He was a good painter, though, and he was an amazing artist that made an impact on our society that very few can match. Hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been interesting. And until next time, Lord willing, there is a next time. May God bless you and your family.